watchdog has written to the Scottish Government asking it to pause plans to simplify the legal requirements for gender recognition. LGBT plus equality campaigners hit back at the unexpected intervention by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, describing its approach as deeply troubling and failing to stand up for the equality of trans people. To discuss this, I'm joined by Susan Smith from For Women Scotland and the human rights campaigner Peter Tatchell. Thank you both ever so much for joining me tonight. Susan, I'm going to come to you first. Do you mind telling us what exactly has the EHRC said and why is it so significant to you?
The EHRC have basically said what a lot of us have been saying for a long time, which is that there are areas of concern.
Oh, I think we've lost Susan there.
They are.
Oh
no. Oh no. Not again.
Susan, we can still hear you, so don't worry. Carry on. We can still hear you now.
Good. Yeah, they've said that there are areas of conflict and concern with women's rights, and that these need to be looked at. They need to be considered. We need to have better conversations, more careful and considered dialogue. They've also said, which I think is critical and has been ignored by a lot of people talking about this, is that it's not just about making a process easier, which is what's being claimed. It's about broadening this out to a whole new cohort of people. And we're no longer talking now about people with a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. We're talking about anybody. And we really need some clarity on definitions and what people mean when they're talking, what cohort they're trying to capture by this and what they hope to achieve.
We've lost you again there, unfortunately, Susan. Let's go to Peter Tatchell. Peter, what do you make of this? Because obviously the EHRC is very much on the side of human rights, and it's stepping in here because it wants more discussion about what is perceived to be a conflict between certain aspects of women's rights and certain aspects of trans rights. Do you accept that that conflict exists and that it requires further discussion?
Well, first, let me say that there is a serious question mark over the independence and integrity of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Its chair and board are appointed by the government. And increasingly recently, those appointments have been of people who take the government's line in opposition to reform of the Gender Recognition Act. And the previous chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, David Isaacs, before he left, expressed concern about political interference from Whitehall in the work of the Commission, which was compromising its independence. So that's one point. The second point, I think it's quite outrageous that a UK body, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, is attempting to interfere in Scottish affairs. You know, this is an issue which is sovereign to Scotland. You know, this is an issue which falls within the remit of devolved powers and therefore should be left entirely to Scottish people and Scottish institutions, including Equality and Human Rights Commissions in Scotland, but not in London.
So leaving aside that, Peter, leaving aside the distinction between obviously what's going on in Scotland and the intervention from a UK-wide body, do you accept that the statements made by the EHRC, which have been, people have said, I mean, for instance, Stonewall says it's an attack on trans equality. Pride Cymru, has said that the EHRC stance is dangerous and transphobic. I mean, surely you don't think that the EHRC is motivated by transphobia, do you?
I don't, but I do think that in saying there hasn't been adequate consultation is a bit rich. There have been two major consultations, and the vast majority of respondents have supported modest reforms to the Gender Recognition Act to make it easier for trans people to affirm their true gender identity in their legal documents. What is proposed in Scotland is called self-ID, self-declaration. But it's not a case that some trans person can just walk in and declare themselves to be trans. It requires them to sign a statutory declaration, which is a legal instrument which has to be signed in front of a justice of the peace, a solicitor, or some other high-standing professional. And if, of course, that trans person doesn't stick to their alleged new gender identity, they can, in theory at least, be held legally liable and face penalties, face even prosecution. So it's not simply that people can declare themselves to be trans on a whim. They have to go through a quasi-legal process. I want to say that I am totally on board with women's rights organizations who are concerned about potential implications for women. But I know from my own experience of women who work in women's centres, I can think of one in the north of England where they've accepted trans women in their women's centre for now a total of 7 years. It was agreed by a vote of the staff and of the women users. And they have had no problem whatsoever. And they point out that they vet all women coming into the centre, whatever their gender identity, they vet them to check they don't have criminal records, they don't have a history of violence or sexual abuse. And I think that is a safeguard.
We have Susan back now, and I want to address Susan about that very point that you're making. As Peter Tatchell has said, the SNP's suggestion doesn't mean that someone can just simply self-identify and that's it. There's no more checks that are required. Do you accept that point of view? And what do you think the dangers might be?
No, because there are no checks. They've proposed to have no checks. You just have to sign a document. And this idea that there will be legal redress, we have no idea. They say, oh, you can be prosecuted for fraud. But we've drilled down. They mean financial fraud. So they mean changing identity to perhaps try and get out of former bankruptcy things. They don't mean changing your identity and then going into a woman's prison and assaulting somebody. That's not counted. There are a couple of things here. Women's centres the women who work in the centres are very, very concerned. We know this, we talk to them all the time. They do not have time to vet people. This is a myth. They do not, when women are turning up desperate and frightened at centres, they are not being vetted. The idea that a UK body as well should not be responsible. The EHRC is charged with the implementation of the Equality Act. The Equality Act is UK-wide legislation. The Scottish Government said to us, the Minister Shona Robertson said to us, the Equality Act was the responsibility of Westminster, and that's one of their excuses for taking no responsibility for dealing with how this interferes with women's rights. So they passed the buck, frankly. They passed the buck in all our conversations back to Westminster and said they were looking for Westminster for guidance. They were looking to the EHRC for guidance on single-sex spaces. Now that they've been given it, and now it's guidance that people don't like, they're suddenly making all manner of extraordinary allegations against the EHRC because the current chair, who went through exactly the same process of selection as the last one, is now a woman of colour who is considering all kinds of options instead of, frankly, a former chair of Stonewall, who really was not looking at the women's rights issues. And she is being subjected to the same sort of abuse women have had on this for ages. And it is not constructive. It is not a helpful way to have this conversation, to throw out allegations of bigotry at everybody who has an issue with some of the problems here. And there are problems. The legislation is deeply, as it's been proposed, is deeply, deeply flawed. And we have to ask, who is it for? And why? Because why do people who are not gender dysphoric need this? And nobody has been able to answer this yet. We don't even know what people mean anymore when they say trans.
Well, let me put that to Peter Tatchell. What could you answer Susan's question there?
Which question?
There were a few in there. What exactly is meant by what exactly is meant by gender self-identity? And why people do seem to have different definitions of this, don't they? And some people don't even believe that it exists as a concept. What do you make of that?
Well, see, my starting point is I accept that biological sex is important, but also accept that gender identity is valid as well. And I don't see why the two should be in conflict. I mean, I haven't heard, there may be one or two examples, but I haven't heard any examples where the many trans women who have been using women's centres have caused a problem. I have not heard of any examples.
But you accept what Susan is saying, that she's been talking to people in single-sex spaces, women who run single-sex spaces, who are concerned. I mean, I know you mentioned that you've spoken to people who aren't concerned, but clearly a lot of people are, and they're not just making that up, are they?
No, I think their concerns should be listened to, and they need to be addressed. I do not dismiss those concerns one iota, But I think there is a way around this where we can reconcile both women's rights and trans rights. And of course, many feminists support a trans inclusive agenda. They support the rights of trans people. They support trans ID. So it is not by a long shot a majority view among women or feminists that trans people should face exclusion. What we do need to do is dialogue with those who disagree and try and find a solution which respects both women's rights and the rights of trans women.
And doesn't the EHRC's statement merely invite precisely the kind of dialogue that you're requesting? Isn't that what it's all about?
Well, yes, but we have been through this process with a very major substantive consultation in the past. So the question is, what would be the fruitfulness of yet another consultation? And it seems to a lot of trans people that they're going back for more and more consultations in the hope that one of them will eventually get the answer that they want. It does look like rigging things, but I'm open to further consultation, but I don't want to see delay in this process. We need to speed it up. We need to ensure that trans people have the dignity, respect, and rights that they so rightly deserve, and which the overwhelming majority, 99.9% of trans women express. All the trans women I know, none of them are the predators who stalk bathrooms and women's centres to violate women. That's complete propaganda.
Well, Peter, I'm going to have to bring Susan in here because we haven't got much time. Susan, I want to just final thought to you. I presume you're not suggesting that trans people are inherently predatory or anything of that kind.
No, this is a not all men argument. I mean, this is what it boils down to. It's saying we should have mixed sex spaces because not all men are predators. We know that, but we also know that men commit 98% of violent crime, and that doesn't change with transition. And the point about the consultation is there's been a lot of misapprehension what happened in this consultation. The consultation responses haven't actually been published from the last one, and they've not been analysed by civil servants. The point of a consultation is not a vote, it's not a popularity, it's to get an idea of the issue. And the EHRC has teased out those issues. The Scottish Government haven't. So we need to be able to address those issues and to all feel safe. And I have great respect for the things Peter has done in the past, enormous respect. And I would like to be able to be in a position where we can all say, these are the areas where, and there are very few areas, but a woman, for example, the other day was talking about being in a hospital ward, and there was a man in a bed who was alternatively being called Albert and Barbara, and he was being abusive. She was frightened. She was a survivor of domestic violence. This isn't helping anybody. People gaming the system aren't helping women. They're not helping trans people. We need a solution that finds space for all of us, and women need to be part of that.
Susan, thank you both, Susan and Peter, for joining me today. This is a very difficult issue. Thank you both for coming on and discussing this matter with me. After the break on Free Speech Nation, we're going to speak to the professor who says young Americans are becoming more